Hi everybody, welcome back to PCS 101, and this is for our Thursday class on the 30th of July. And as you can see in the syllabus, I didn't have any readings scheduled for my chapters. Instead, what I ended up having was a quiz. If we were meeting in class, you would be taking this quiz in person, and it would be closed book, closed notes. But obviously we're not meeting in class. So what I've done is I've attached the quiz questions to the notes for this post, and you're free to use your notes and your book if you'd like. You've got 48 hours to answer those quiz questions, which I'm hopeful are questions that are more than just making sure that you've read the text and that you've been paying attention, but they also are questions to help you in terms of delivering your first speech. And all of your speeches, but especially your first speech, which is what we are preparing for. And that first speech is going to be this upcoming Tuesday on the 4th. Now, I've heard from some of you, but not all of you. I've heard from 6 of you. Technically, I've got 11 students registered in the class, though I think there's one student who's registered who isn't necessarily still part of this class. But if you haven't contacted me already, you need to contact me to indicate how you would like to deliver your first speech on the 4th of August. And the way to contact me is through email, ruiz@gcc.mass.edu. Though if you'll remember that today, from 12 to 12:30, I will be doing our Zoom for our class, so you can also touch base with me that way if you'd like. So in terms of uploading the speeches thus far, I've got 4 students who have indicated that they want to upload. That's Willow, Ray, Letitia, and Kelton. I hope I pronounced that correctly. And in terms of delivering your speeches via Zoom, I've got 2 students thus far, Leah and Trisha. And in terms of what I will do for those who are interested in presenting their speeches on Zoom is that I will try to find a common time where most, if not all of us, are available on the 4th so that we could do that via Zoom. So I've still got time to be determined, just in terms of whether or not there might be 1 or 2 of you more that might be interested in delivering a speech via Zoom on the 4th of August, and hopefully we can find the time. If it turns out that you wanted to deliver a speech via Zoom, but we haven't been able to find a time that you can participate, you can always upload your speech as well. Now, I spoke to the IT department about the best way to go about doing this, and the IT department indicated that GCC is having some challenges in terms of having storage capacities. So the best thing to do would be to upload your video to YouTube, list it as unlisted, then embed the link in our Moodle forum, and I will create a forum for this. And then you can delete the video from YouTube. In other words, you would use YouTube for the uploading, and then ultimately you could delete that video so that you're the only one who sees that particular video. And according to IT, it's best to verify your account on YouTube before uploading to prevent any errors uploading longer videos. Though for our first speech, that's a 5-minute speech, but by the time we get to our last speech, that'll be a 15-minute speech. So if you don't necessarily know how to go about doing that, I've included the instructions that IT supplied, and you can see those in our notes, but basically you log on to studio.youtube.com, you click the blue button on the dashboard, you drag and drop your MP4 file, or click the select files button to open a file picker window. And then on the details window, you can add a description as the video is being uploaded. Then when you click next, you'll be prompted to identify if the video is intended for children. Most users end up skipping the next step, which is adding any elements. And then finally, on the visibility tab, set the visibility to unlisted, then click save. If you are having technical problems, you can always contact me. You can contact the GCC library, or you could contact the GCC IT office, and all of us should be able to provide you with some assistance. And what I'm going to be doing is, for those of you who upload your speeches, I will be posting a way for all of you to comment on those particular speeches, identifying strengths and weaknesses, much like you did with sample speeches, actually. But that would be for each of the speeches of your classmates, and that's how you would get credit for that particular class, in addition to delivering your own speech. And really, one of the best ways to learn how to deliver speeches is not only to have the experience of delivering your own speech, but watching lots of speeches from your peers. So, in terms of the Zoom, what we will be doing is working in live time, so we can talk to one another in live time about strengths and weaknesses. For both sets of speeches, what I will be doing is filling out that template that I've included in the documents, as well as some brief comments, and send that to you via email so that you can see your grade. I ask that all of you send me your speaking outline via email, and that's Ruiz, R-U-I-Z, @gcc.mass.edu, so I can review the speaking outline and give you some suggestions for perhaps how you can improve it, because the speaking outline is also a part of the speech itself, so you shouldn't be delivering a speech without a speaking outline, which is part of what we talked about last class when we were talking about the impromptu speech, and that you definitely don't want to memorize your speech, and you definitely don't want to read your speech. What you want is a speaking outline with keywords and phrases that will jog your memory, and then you can fill that in with unscripted information. And I believe I've used this analogy in the past, kind of liken it to having an important conversation with someone, perhaps a significant other. If you were interested in perhaps ending the relationship, that chances are you've probably thought of some points that you want to make to explain why, and you've probably anticipated some objections or questions so that you can address them. But you certainly wouldn't want to be reading off of a script. Though I hear nowadays that people are ending relationships via social media. I'm not so sure about that. But at any rate, my suggestion would be that you don't do such a thing. In terms of the sample speeches you saw, I selected 3 student sample speeches to try to give you a sense of how you could proceed with your autobiographical speech, and also some of the things to consider when you are thinking about presenting any kind of speech. The first speech that we saw from Jessica Ryan, and she was from the military. And one of the reasons why I wanted to show that particular speech was to talk a little bit about culture. And if you remember last class, we discussed that culture could be any group membership, and that some cultures are larger than others, and that there is a predictive element somewhat to culture, because behaviors, values, attitudes, and beliefs oftentimes are influenced by culture. But we have to be careful not to stereotype and assume that just because someone belongs to a particular culture, that all of those behaviors, values, attitudes, and beliefs are going to be predetermined. We also have, of course, individual variants. But you could see from that very first speech, it's a very different kind of speech than the kinds of speeches that we are likely to deliver. She's got audience members who are dressed in uniform, who are standing up. She herself is dressed in uniform, not using a podium, not using speaking notes. Again, a much higher level of formality. I assume that's because of the military culture in which they're in. That said, she had a good introduction, she had a good body, she had a good conclusion. You might have noticed that she focused on 3 elements about herself, and that oftentimes is a very typical technique for both writing papers and also for delivering speeches, that you focus on 3. She gave a few details about each of those. And while certainly at the ending of the speech we don't have a complete view of who she is as a person, that would never be possible in 5 minutes. We do know more about her than we did previously. So, and that's the whole point of the autobiographical speech, is that you're sharing some information about yourself so your audience can get to know you a little bit better. And she's got a good intro, a good body, and a good conclusion. The second speech, I deliberately assigned that particular speech the I Want to Be a Millionaire speech for a couple of reasons. First, as several of you noted, the delivery is very stilted and very monotone. My suspicion is that this person is either reading their speech or they've memorized their speech. You want to be very careful not to do such a thing. We talked about the idea that you could have some technical difficulties if you're using a teleprompter. Michael Bay was the link that I showed you. He was able to manage for just a few seconds without his teleprompter. It all fell apart after that, and as skilled as he is in public speaking and as professional as he is in his career, he basically walked off stage. It was a very embarrassing moment. But even if you're using low tech, this student, I suspect, perhaps just scotch taped the notes on the opposite wall and could read them. It looks like he's reading. You have to be very skilled when you are reading and appear spontaneous, and that manuscript speech or the written speech that's read, usually it's done for highly formal events where there's little or no room for error. Think about something like perhaps a news broadcast where you've got to get it down right to the second in terms of timing. So those are not the kinds of speeches that we will be delivering. That said, I really liked in that second speech how he used props. I wish he had interact a little bit more naturally with those props. Again, he's very stiff, but adding props definitely helps in terms of offering your audience a visual. Not that you have to use props for this first speech, but you will be using some audio or visual for your second speech, and we'll talk about that further. And I don't know if you noticed with the I Want to Be a Millionaire speech, but he really doesn't offer the audience an opportunity to settle in before he begins with his speech. So in terms of what I would avoid doing is beginning the way he began, and instead just beginning with something like hi, and perhaps even introducing his name and then going into I want to be a millionaire, because if you miss that first line, then you're playing catch up for the rest of the speech itself. The third speech is a speech that I normally wouldn't show in class. I had indicated that the third speech I usually show happens to be through a textbook company, but I'm unable to stream that speech to you or to present that speech to you. There's some technical issues involved. And one of the reasons why I like doing that speech was because there were two versions of the same speech, so you could see the similarities and the differences. And in that particular speech, he also talks about his sexual identity. So that's a speech where he decides to disclose some rather personal information about himself. And I usually make the point that that's perfectly fine as long as you do it in a professional, respectful manner. But that said, you don't have to disclose personal information about yourself. And if you think about the speech that I did choose for us to watch, the third speech, basically it focuses on education with a good amount of storytelling, which was the suggestion that I gave you if you didn't want to self-disclose too much, is that you could always talk about your educational background or your educational goals, or if nothing else, why you happen to be in this particular summer class at GCC. You can see that this speaker, English is not his first language, and that said, we don't necessarily expect to have a level of pronunciation that's perfect, as long as it's understandable, which he is. And that gets to one of the earlier lessons that I had talked about, that you don't necessarily have to have perfect pronunciation, but what you want to have is enunciation, and make sure that you're not mumbling, because you're not going to be able to change your pronunciation patterns over a series of weeks, and probably not even over a series of months. And unless you're going into acting or broadcasting, chances are you wouldn't need to do that anyway. So those three speeches are all examples of different ways you could proceed. Again, we can't necessarily evaluate those speeches based on volume, because we're adjusting the volume so that we can hear. We can't necessarily evaluate these speeches based on length, because they didn't have the criteria that I'm giving you, which is 5 minutes, give or take a little bit on either end. But outside of that, I think they serve as good models for what we've been talking about thus far over the course of the semester. So again, you will be watching all of the uploaded speeches from your classmates and talking about strength and weakness, if you do elect to upload your speech. And if you would prefer to have a speech done via Zoom in live time, there is that option as well. Personally, I wish that we could all be live in person. That's what public speaking is about, but as you know, that isn't necessarily an option right now. So In terms of what you have to do, you've got a 20-question quiz. Again, feel free to use your notes. Feel free to use the textbook. Some of the questions are based on the chapters. Some of the questions might be based on things that I would have discussed in the previous videos one way or another. And then definitely contacting me for when you want to deliver your first speech, or I should say how you want to deliver your first speech, whether you want to upload it or do it via Zoom. And if you are doing it via Zoom, to give me a time. Now, the second thing I would have done during this class if we were meeting in person is at the ending of your quizzes, the rest of the class would have been devoted to a practice session, and I would have talked with each of you individually to get a sense as to how things are going with your speeches, and then you could utilize the practice session in whatever way you thought would be best. So you could actually deliver a speech and I could give you feedback, or we could just talk a little bit about how to construct an outline, or we could even come up with ideas as to what you could discuss and what your thesis might be. So I use practice in the very broadest sense of the word, and I want to duplicate that. So one of the things that I've also asked that you do is that you contact me individually, ruiz@gcc.mass.edu, as several of you already have, and indicate when you might want to have that practice session or when you're available to have that practice session. I'm going to try to be flexible in terms of this. So, because again, we're in unusual circumstances. Your date is before the 4th, because the 4th is when you would actually be delivering. So do contact me as soon as possible and let me know when we can touch base about your speech. And we don't need to do that via Zoom. We can do that via Zoom if you'd like, but we could also do that via telephone. Again, I want to be as flexible as possible and make myself available to you as you are preparing your speech. So I hope you're well. I'm well. I will be in our Zoom meeting for class between 12 and 12:30, and I really look forward to hearing your speeches. Take care. Bye-bye.